So recently I was watching this movie on Disney Plus called Raya and the Last Dragon. And it's one of those movies I believe even right now you need to pay a premium to go see it on Disney Plus. But when it first came out, I paid that premium mainly because I wanted my mom to see it, because it has sort of an Asian theme, but also because we both really love Disney films. Anyways, truth be told, I wasn't really chomping at the bit to see Raya and the Last Dragon. Maybe because I wasn't really familiar with the ad campaign, but even the few kind of two-dimensional ads I kind of saw, I wasn't super impressed. And even when I kind of got the motivation to start seeing the movie, the first couple minutes or so, I wasn't super impressed again because I guess there were a few kind of corny jokes which kind of reminded me of The Emperor's New Groove. And to be honest, I wasn't really in the mood for seeing that type of Disney film. But as is typical with streaming channels, you can come back to things multiple times. And so, if you're watching a show, you're watching a TV show or a movie, and you can always come back to it later on and pick up where you last left off. So that was definitely the case with me when it came to Raya and the Last Dragon. So even though it sounds kind of strange, I watched Raya and the Last Dragon for the first time over a period of 2 weeks. And I have to say that at the end of those 2 weeks, I was just blown away. I mean, it's an amazing film. It's certainly one of the best Disney films I've ever seen in my entire life, and certainly that's saying something. So, as a matter of background, the movie is set in this fictional land called Kumandra, which is loosely based on various Southeast Asian countries, so places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and whatnot. And you know it's fictional because basically the land is populated by both people and dragons. So, the preface of the film is narrated by Raya, the lead character. And she talks about how at the beginning there was a sort of a symbiotic relationship between dragons and humans, right? As a result of which there was harmony, there was peace, and there was water, right? But then suddenly there arrived on the scene these beings called the Droon. And the Droon, basically, they're murderous cloud formations that move across land, right? And when they touch beings, when they touch different beings like humans or dragons, those things become petrified. They become stone, right? And so, as the story goes, in the early going, the Droon were basically turning everything into stone, right? And so both humans and dragons are being kind of wiped out in a certain sense. And then the dragons, as sort of their last stand, they came together and they concentrated all their dragon magic into the stone, which became known as the dragon gem. And they gave it to the last dragon, Sisu. And Sisu used the dragon gem to basically wipe out the Droon. So everyone came back except for the dragons. And Sisu herself disappeared, and no one kind of really knew where she went. So that's kind of what happened in the context of the preface of the film. Now, in the aftermath of this great sacrifice on the part of the dragons, the idea is that one might expect that the people would come together and just be grateful. But as Ryan tells the story, these people fought together to possess the dragon gem, this last remnant of dragon magic, as a result of which Kumandra was divided into different regions, each one representing a different part, a different body part of a dragon. So the regions included heart, fang, tail, talon, and spine. Anyways, 500 years later, Raya shows up on the scene formally, right? So at this point, she's still a little girl, but, it is what it is. And her father is the chief of hearts. And his great dream is to reunify Kumandra, right? So what he does is that he invites all the different leaders, all the different peoples of the different regions of Kumandra to come together for this feast as sort of a starting point to build or reestablish peace and harmony. And in the context of this feast, Raya befriends this little girl from the region of Fang named Namari, right? And Namari gives her this dragon pendant. Turns out they're both kind of dragon geeks and whatnot, and they have certain things in common. And as a result of this kind of initial bond, Raya trusts Namari and then shows her where the dragon gem is kept, right? So all this time has been kept in hearts, right? So Raya shows Namari where the dragon gem is being kept, but then Namari betrays her, and she alerts the people of Fang that she now knows where the gem is being kept. But then the other groups get one of this too, and so they all arrive, they start fighting for possession of the dragon gem, as a result of which the gem is suddenly dropped and it's broken into different pieces. As a result of which the Droons suddenly come back and they start turning people back into stone. So the people, in a panic, they start picking up different pieces of the dragon gem. They realize that even the fragmented pieces still have the power to repel the Droon. And so what ends up happening is that each region has a piece of the dragon gem. But in the immediate circumstance, the people are running away from the Droon. including Raya and her father. And they find themselves eventually on this bridge. And so the Droon are coming, they're turning people into stone. And basically, Raya's father, he's been hit in the leg by an arrow, so he's kind of limping. And he realizes that he can't outrun the Droon. And so he wants to save his daughter. So he kind of holds his daughter and he says, like, you are now formally the guardian of the dragon gem. And he throws her off of the bridge into the water below, in the aftermath of which he becomes stone. Okay. Now, the story progresses even further. So basically, the whole region of Kumandra has become sort of a barren wasteland. So the Droon are still active and rampant. A lot of people have been turned into stone. And things are looking pretty dire. And Raya, for her part, she takes it upon herself to try to find Sisu, with the intention of finding Sisu and kind of working with Sisu to bring salvation, if you will, back into the world. Like, mindful of the fact that she did it before, maybe she can do it again. So basically what happens is that Raya finds herself at the end of this river, because basically the legend was that Sisu eventually ended up at the end of one of these different rivers. And so she says this prayer, and then Sisu returns. So basically when Sisu comes back to life, she and Raya make this pact to go to different regions of Kumandra, steal all the different fragments of the dragon gem, and reunite the dragon gem once and for all, in a certain sense, to try to beat down the Droon, if you will. And they do that, right? So they go to these different regions, tail, town, spine, and whatnot, and they steal these different pieces, and along the way they pick up different characters who come along for the adventure. But then finally they come to Fang, where the final gem piece is supposed to be, and that's obviously where Namari lives. At which point the characters in the story begin to argue amongst themselves as to what's the best way to recover the last gem piece from Fang, in particular from Namari. And so one kid says, well, why don't we just go in there and fight, and just get the gem piece that way. But then Sisu has a different plan. So she says, well, look, let's just go in and be friendly and offer a gift to Namari. And she'll be so touched in her heart, she'll want to be friends forever, and she'll willingly give us the last remaining piece of the dragon gem. Now, as to be expected, Raya isn't too keen on this particular plan, because she still has the woundedness in her heart as a result of having been betrayed by Namari. And so then Sisu tells her the story about what actually happened all those different years ago, which led to the original destruction of the Droon. So basically what Sisu says is that, when they were surrounded by the Droon, the remaining dragons, they realized they had to kind of trust each other, right? So they concentrated all their magic into the dragon gem, and they entrusted the gem, and by extension, their power and their lives, to Sisu. And Sisu, she's like, I don't know why they trusted me, but like, I trusted them and they trusted me, but their deep trust in me really empowered me in a way which just completely blew me away, right? And so by telling the story, Sisu invites Raya to have that same type of trust. And so, again, as to be expected, Raya still struggles with this. Like, how can I trust Namari? But what puts her over the top is that Sisu says, well, look, imagine if you could. Imagine if you could bring to the table that type of trust. You could realize Kumandra, which is your father's dream. So basically, as a result of giving this gift to Namari, which happens to be the dragon pendant from the beginning of the film, Namari decides to meet them in a neutral location. But she's fearful herself, so she has a crossbow. So at a certain point, Sisu is dialoguing with Namari, and Namari is still kind of scared. And Raya herself is scared, and she believes that Namari is on the verge of shooting Sisu with the crossbow, so she throws her sword, but inadvertently that's the thing which triggers the release of the arrow from the crossbow, and Sisu is shot and killed. As a result of which the Droon show up on the scene, because here's now the death of the last dragon. So the water dries up, and all this time the water's been holding off the Droon because apparently they're afraid of water. But yeah, so in the absence of the last dragon and the water, the Droon come on the scene, and they're just turning everyone into stone. Now, for her part, Raya is so upset that Sisu has been shot and killed by Namari that she's just blinded by her rage. And so even though there are people around her who basically need her help, including her companions who are her friends, she's so blinded by anger and revenge and this desire to basically kill Namari that she's just caught up in that as opposed to this idea of love and helping the other. And in fact, it's only when Namari brings to her attention that she had an equal part in a certain sense of bringing about the death of Sisu that Raya snaps out of it. And so they start to work together to try to escape the clutches of the Droon. But that brings us to the climax of the story. So basically, at this point in the movie, Raya, Namari, and Raya's friends are basically surrounded by the Droon, and they're trying to fend off the Droon using these different fragments of the Dragon Gem, but the magic is clearly fading. So everyone's obviously in a panic. At which point, Raya recalls that earlier conversation with Sisu, where Sisu basically describes to her what happened over 500 years ago, which ultimately led to the destruction of the Droon. And then she realizes that the power of the Dragon Gem is not really derived from magic, but it's derived from trust. And so she realizes that they need to learn to trust each other to basically save the world. And so, first of all, she invites everyone to give her their own different fragments, because everyone has a fragment, to kind of reunite and reestablish the Dragon Gem. But then Namari is a little bit reluctant. So what happens is Raya takes the first step. And so she gives her fragment to Namari, steps back. She's consumed by the Droon, and she turns to stone. And obviously, it's such a powerful gesture that it inspires the other people to do the same. So Raya's companions, they take turns giving to Namari their own fragments of the Dragon Gem, and they step back and they too are turned into stone. So until finally Namari is left with all these different fragments. And she's tempted to kind of like run away and just like take off and whatever, kind of fend for herself with all these accumulated fragments. But then she looks back at Raya and her companions, and it's a really moving thing. They're all like obviously they've all been petrified, but they're together in this like unified formation. And so she finds herself being incredibly moved and touched by their collective sacrifice. So she goes back to where they are. She puts together the Dragon Gem herself, steps back, puts her hand on Raya's shoulder, and allows the Droon to turn her into stone as well. And this point in the movie is really beautiful. There's this moment of silence where the Droon are kind of doing their thing. Everyone's been turned to stone, and like it just looks like all is lost. But then all of a sudden, the Dragon Gem recovers its power, and just like that, the Droon are just like completely blown away. The water comes back, the people come back, the dragons themselves are restored, and they in turn bring Sisu back to life. And so at the end, there's this really great scene where Raya comes back to the region of hearts, back to that bridge, and she sees her father. And her father is picking up this flag, I believe. And up to this point, she hasn't really been sure if the father would recognize her because it's been 6 years or so. But then, the father turns around and he has this pet name for her. He calls her Dewdrop. And so, she calls him Ba. That's her name for him. She says Ba. She has this kind of like faint smile, as if preparing her heart for the fact that he might not recognize her. But then he says Dewdrop. And so, yeah, she just breaks down and they run to each other, and there's really emotional embrace. But then what happens is, so Sisu arrives in the scene, and Raya introduces the father to Sisu. And I believe Sisu says, hope you don't mind, but we brought a few friends. And all of a sudden, like on the bridge, you see all these different people for different regions, talon, tail, spine, fang. And they're all back, and they're happy and they're unified. And then what happens is Raya turns to her father and says, welcome to Kamandra. And so basically, the father's dream has been realized. I've seen that particular scene multiple times because obviously I have a subscription to Disney Plus, and I've played that scene over and over again on TV and on my phone and stuff, and it gets me every single time. Obviously, yeah. And then with that, like the movie ends. Kumandra is reestablished. Now, I know that's a lot of detail, and I just spent a lot of time just summarizing the movie, but you'll see there's a whole point to it. And I just want to kind of walk you through certain scenes which touched me, and kind of expound for you certain themes which I kind of derive from that from a Christian and Catholic perspective. So I guess the first thing that comes to mind is this notion of intentional discipleship. And I don't know who's the first person to kind of coin this phrase, but for myself, I think I first encountered it in my reading of this book called Forming Intentional Disciples by Sherry Waddell. And so basically, Sherry Waddell, her thesis in that book is that you got to choose to become a disciple of the Lord, hence intentional discipleship. So what's a disciple? A disciple is basically another Christ. So what's the goal? To not simply know what Christ knows, to not simply know Christian things, is to become another Christ in this world. And that's the Great Commission, right? What's the mission of the church? To make disciples of all nations, in service of which is the going and the baptizing and the teaching, right? That's what we're meant to do as a church. The church is inherently missionary. The church doesn't just have a mission. The church actually is a mission. But more to the point, when it comes to discipleship building, eventually I need to own it for myself, right? And so John Paul II talks about a similar thing. And so just to paraphrase, he says basically that the sacraments are not magic, So you think about baptism, for example, right? So I'm baptized, and so, original sin is wiped away. Certainly I become a child of God, right? I'm reborn in the image of Christ, right? But at the same time, I need to really own my baptismal vows, right? And funny enough, like it ties back to the movie, right? So you think about, Raya's father on the bridge, right? So he tells Raya, "You are the guardian of the dragon gem now." And so she is, but she isn't, right? So she has to become that over time. And it's underlined by the fact that she is subsequently plunged in the water, right? So harkening back to baptism, right? So she's baptized in that moment and therefore takes on the mission of her father, right? But at the same time, she has to really own it over time. Because, of course, what's the culmination of the mission? The realization of Kumandra, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind, like this notion of intentional discipleship. Second kind of thing that comes to mind, it's almost like a throwaway detail, but like that scene where Raya is praying, if you will, to Sisu. Like the nature of her prayer is extremely moving, right? So basically what she says, like there's this moment of great honesty and vulnerability, right? So she's praying to Sisu, and she says, basically how I feel is that this whole mess is my fault. Like I trusted someone that I shouldn't have trusted. I trusted Namari. And now, like, the world's a mess, and my father's gone. And then she says on that, I just really want to see my dad, And it's just, like, really powerful moment where it's just, like, you feel it for her. I mean, obviously that's a scene I've watched multiple times too, right? But the point I want to raise to you is that, like, in terms of her prayer, it's honest, it's sincere, it's vulnerable, and engages the heart and the spirit and the mind. And, like, that type of prayer is always heard by the Lord, right? So it gives us a certain model as to how to pray in an idealized form, if you will. Okay. Now, obviously, the main theme in the movie is trust. I mean, hopefully that goes without saying. The main theme of the movie is, in fact, trust. But like, I don't want to say like, therefore, like the takeaway message is you should trust, right? There are different facets as it relates to kind of Christian theology. So first of all, the notion of original sin, right? So as you know from the book of Genesis, there's a story of Adam and Eve, and there's original sin, which resulted in this fragmentation of the world. So disorder our relationship with other people, our relationship with God, disorder within ourselves, even in our relationship with the world. So basically, original sin was a pretty bad thing. But more to the point, when you look at the Catechism, it says we don't really know what the original sin was, right? But we do know it was preceded by a lack of trust. It was preceded by a lack of trust. So somewhere along the way, Adam and Eve, they failed to trust God. They failed to trust God, and that's what resulted in disorder across the board, right? And let that be a lesson for us, I mean, oftentimes there's a way to practice, obviously, the Catholic faith in a way which is very superficial, functional, like focusing on liturgical practice or external norms or whatnot. But you got to ask yourself, okay, do I in fact trust the Lord? Do I in fact trust the Lord, or am I just going through the motions in terms of the Christian thing, right? Mindful of the fact that it was a lack of trust which led to this problem to begin with, right? So fundamentally speaking, do I trust the Lord with my hopes and my dreams, my fears and my sins and my brokenness, like everything? Mindful of the fact that what is holiness, right? Holiness is belonging, belonging entirely to Christ, belonging entirely to God. So do I trust God with my life? Very important thing. Another aspect of trust, to kind of realize that deep trust in God and deep trust in yourself, they're not in competition. They're one and the same, you know, which is a really important point, right? So to think about it like this, God calls you to holiness. God calls you to be a saint. God perhaps calls you to be a great saint. But an important prerequisite to realizing that dream of God is to believe that it's true. God calls me to holiness. God calls me to greatness. And so my deep desire to realize my hopes and my dreams and whatever, I got to realize those things are caught up in my particular call or vocation to holiness, to sainthood. And if God calls me to these things, it must be possible, right? So there might be times where I'm inclined to get discouraged because I look at myself, my weakness, my frailty, and my sin. But I got to trust in God's call. Deep trust in God and deep trust in myself are both one and the same thing. Okay. Second thing, this is kind of related. To realize that, okay, if God calls me to greatness, if God calls me to holiness, and there's the universal call to holiness, that means I got to trust God's call in relation to my neighbor too, right? I got to trust that this person who I perhaps am in conflict with or perhaps I don't like, that person is called to holiness too, right? So if the call to holiness applies to me and trusting in God's call to greatness with regards to me, it must also apply to my neighbor as well, including and especially in a certain sense, the neighbor that I don't particularly get along with in these particular circumstances right now. And that's really important for us to kind of keep in mind as we're dealing with people. Like the moment we are reductive in our dealings with people, like who is this person? This person is simply a jerk without the potential for redemption. Like what are we doing? Like immediately our apostolic efforts will probably not bear fruit because like we've given up before the thing even begins. You got to believe that this person that you're dealing with, regardless of who they are, even that person is called to be great. Even that person is called to be a saint. Another thing with regards to trust to consider is obviously this notion of the prophetic gesture. Deep trust in the other as a prophetic gesture, which is no small point. And so I'm framing it in theological terms, but it's the most obvious aspect of trust that you see in the movie, right? So again, what moves Namare to love? What moves Namare to lay down her life? It's seeing Raya and all the other people lay down their lives. How will they know that we are Christian? By our love. And what's love? Not simply being polite, not simply being nice, but being sacrificial in a habitual sort of way, right? And people get that intuitively. Even if they don't know, again, like theology and whatnot, they understand when someone is living out of a habitual stance of self-sacrifice. And that, throughout all the ages, is always extremely moving. It's always an extremely moving prophetic gesture which leads people ultimately to conversion of heart. So a really important point to keep in mind. Final point with regards to trust, though, is this idea that even though there might be moments where I might be inclined not to not trust God's call, to not trust other people, to not trust myself, I got to recall that God is the one who trusted us first. And again, John Paul II talks about this. So he says, who was the first person to trust, for example, the Blessed Virgin Mary? It was God the Father. The Incarnation, right? So God the Father entrusts his only begotten Son to the Blessed Virgin Mary and by extension to all of us, right? But here's the thing, the Lord knows when he entrusts himself to humanity that we will hurt him, we will reject him. He's made himself vulnerable, but at the same time, we won't really appreciate that gift. But he does it all the same, right? And so for us, that should be an incredibly moving thing. Christ is entrusted to us by God the Father through the Incarnation and ultimately through the Crucifixion. God the Father gives to us his only begotten Son for the salvation of the world. He gives us his Son such that we might live. And again, more to the point, that should move us to entrust ourselves to God, to entrust ourselves to his plan, to really trust his call, and to put ourselves actually in positions of vulnerability vis-a-vis our neighbor, to constantly put ourselves in a position where we are loving the other person, even though we might be hurt, even though our love might not be reciprocated, in imitation of God the Father, who entrusted himself to us first. Okay, one final note, and I'll kind of end with this. So again, the movie ends with the reunion between Raya and her father, and the reunion of Kamandra in general. And it should give us a certain kind of foretaste as to what the end times will actually be like, right? So the end times, they're not simply the end of this pilgrim journey of suffering and strife, although certainly there is that, right? It's meant to be the coming together of all the various strands of human history in a way which is in accordance with God's love and in accordance with his providence. Now, practically speaking, this means a couple things. First of all, this idea that when we arrive at the pearly gates, we should be mindful of the fact that we have not simply brought ourselves, but other people. And this is not some arbitrary thing. The whole point is that when we do that, we have therefore become persons of love. We have become aware that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, right? And so the whole idea is not simply to get ourselves to heaven, but to do what we can to bring other people to heaven as well. But the second thing is this, and this is kind of related, to think about what is the driving motivation of Raya throughout the course of the film. It's to be reunited with her father, for sure, but then later on she discovers she also desires to realize his dream of Kamandra. And that's kind of indicative of the spiritual life, right? So, for example, when we pray, especially before the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, what happens? Over time, we learn to love what God loves and to hate what he hates. We learn to take on his hopes and his dreams and his desires. And what does he desire? He desires the salvation of his people, right? And so that should become our dream as well. Again, who can I bring with me in terms of the fullness of salvation, the fullness of redemption? Mindful of the fact that in a certain sense, it's not really about them. It's about pleasing my Father in heaven. And I guess for me, that's why the end of the film is the most moving part of the movie for me. Because never mind the joy that obtains through the reunion between the father and the daughter, just to see the joy on the father's face, it speaks to the joy that our Father feels at the realization of his dream. And I gotta say for myself, I want to do everything I can to help the Father realize his dream. And I want to propose to you that hopefully you're committed to that too. To do your part to help realize the dream of God the Father, which basically amounts to the salvation of the world. And may God bless you all.